All right, with Hashem's help, we will learn today Yevamos Daf Nun Hey. We left off last time on Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph, 2 lines, second line from the top, Min Lolan. We have previously quoted the Braisa that gave extensive cases in which we see that the prohibition for a man to marry his wife's sister, this is a isur that has qaras on it, and therefore, according to the opinion of the Chachamim, taking aside the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, kedushin will not be chal. The Braisa gave a case in which the kedushin was not chal because the person mistakenly gave kedushin to one's wife's sister, to achos ishtoi, and the cases were both where one's wife's sister were a sister paternally and also a sister maternally. Both paternal and maternal sisters. So the question is, Minalan, from where do we know that the Isur of Achais Ishtay goes both to maternal and to paternal sisters? So the Gemara says, Yalaf Machoisai, because we compared the din of Achais Ishtay to the Isur of one marrying one sister, and Ma'achoisai, just like the Isur for one to marry one sister, refers both to a sister min ha'av, a paternal sister, ubein min ha'em, and to a maternal sister, afkan, when it comes to the Isur of marrying one's wife's sister, Achais Ishtay, bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em. Ask the Gemara, v'leilef midday dasei, why don't we compare Achais Ishtay to the Isser of marrying one's father's brother's wife? And over there, as we explained, and as we learned beforehand a few times, that the Isser of marrying one's father's brother's sister, midday eraisa, is only madday dasei min ha'av, it's only if it's one's father's brother's paternal brother. V'loy min ha'em, and midday eraisa, one is not prohibited to marry one's father's maternal's brother's wife. So why do we compare it to the din of the aunt? Afkan min ha'av v'loy min ha'em. Answers the Gemara, mistabra ma'choisa havalel melav, that it makes more sense for one to need to learn it from the din of achoisai. Why? Because we compare krevei atzmai. We compare the isur of marrying one's relative from one's own generation. One's own meaning a sister is one's own relative, and the isur of one's wife's sister is an isur that is one's own because he was the one that married his wife. Unlike his aunt, whose marriage was affected not through his generation but through his father's brother's marriage. Counters the Gemara Adarabba. But on the other hand, midday dasei havalei melav, achos ishtay is more similar to uday dasei because both of them come through because of a marriage. Shekein davar al yidei kedushin midavar al yidei kedushin, and not from a sister which is one's blood relative. So the Gemara answers, Ella, you're right. If we have to choose between achosai and doidasai, perhaps achos ishtay is more similar to doidasai. Ella me'eshes ach yalfinon. We learn it out from the Isser that one has to marry one's brother's wife. The shekain davar al yidei kedushin. The kravei atzmai, since eshes ach is both an Isser of erva that comes because of marriage. It's one's brother's wife, and also one's brother is on one's same generation as oneself. And that is more similar to doidas. But now the Gemara asks, Ve'eshes ach gufa minalei. How do we know that the Isur midayraisa of marrying one's brother's wife refers both to a paternal and to a maternal brother? The Tanya, we have a Braisa when it says in Vayikra, the Isur of marrying Eshes ach, there is a extra ending of the pasuk. It says, Ervas Eshes achicha loisagali. A man is not allowed to have a relation with one's brother's wife. And here, just by heart, the pasuk ends, Ervas achicha hi. And as we'll see later, these extra words come to teach you that not only is it min ha'ah, but also min ha'im. So the Braisa only begins with the reisha of the pasuk. So when it says ervas eshes achicha loisegale, says the Braisa, you should know, and that's the halacha. It's bein min ha'av or bein min ha'im. And now the Braisa asks, perhaps it's only a paternal brother. So to which counters the Braisa, no. That since Chiyev ba'achoisai, Chiyev kan v'chiyev ba'achoisai, you have an Isur here of Eishes Ach and an Isur of sister, ma'achoisai beimin ha'av beimin ha'em. So we compared this case here also, Eishes Ach from the Isur of one sister, and therefore it's going to be beimin ha'av beimin ha'em. Goes back to Braisa, kalech l'derech zu. But perhaps take another approach, a different approach. That Chiyev kan v'chiyev b'daydasei. Same question. There's an Isur of Eishes Ach. There's an Isur of one's father's brother's wife. Perhaps by Deidasai for sure it's only min ha'av v'loy min ha'em. Afkan min ha'av v'loy min ha'em. So the Braisa answers, Nida limidoima, let us see to what this is more comparable to. Donin krevei atzmai mikrevei atzmai. We compare, again, the same generational Isur from the same generational Isur, and don't bring in the aunt, brother's father's wife, shekrevei ha'av, because that's closer to the father. The Braisa comes back, perhaps go to the other way, which is done in davar shalidei kedushin, midavar shalidei kedushin. Why don't you compare Eishes Ach to Deidasei? Both are ervas that come because of a marriage. They're not direct blood relatives. And Valtechiach from Achoisei she'isur rabba me'elov. So now the Braisa says, since the pasuk ends ervas ochicha hi, and that whole ending is extra, so the reish of the pasuk, which answers, which tells you can't marry ervas eishes ochicha, you would take a thought that it only refers to a paternal brother's wife. But now that the pasuk adds ervas ochichehi beimin ha'av beimin ha'em. So now asks the Braisa ve'ema, true, there's an extra ending of the pasuk, but why don't we say it comes to teach you something else? Maybe both the reish of the pasuk and the ending ervas ochichehi is only referring to one's paternal's brother's wife be'eshes ach min ha'av. Why do we have to have two parts of the pasuk? Chada the yesh labanam b'chayi bayla and v'chada the ein labanam b'chayi bayla. Really, when it comes to the Isra of Eishes Ach, which, as we all know, has the great exception of yibum, which is when one's brother passes away without children, then not only does the Isra fall away, but there's actually a mitzvah to be miyabim his brother's wife. Let's speak about where one is not allowed to marry one's brother's wife, and let's give three scenarios. One is when the brother is still alive, meaning obviously he divorced his wife. If he didn't divorce his wife, she's asur because she's a married woman. But when one's brother divorces his wife with children, he can't marry her because of the Isur of Eishes Ach. That's the first case where one cannot marry one's brother's wife, alive with children. Then there's another case where one's brothers divorced his wife and they have no children. And mind you, in such a case, if he were to die, then there would be a mitzvah of yibum before he divorced his wife. But here he divorced his wife and he does not have children. That's another scenario where one is not allowed to marry her. And the third case is when one is not alive without children. One is not alive with children. Since he left children, weiter, you're not allowed to marry one's wife. Now, here in the Havamina, the Gemara has it clear that in case, the third case that we mentioned, that the Isur is that you cannot marry your brother's widow when he died, when he left children, that's almost clearly written in the Pasuk. The Pasuk says when there's no children, make Yibum, which implies that when there is children, you cannot make Yibum. Even though that also could be challenged, as we'll get to in a moment. But when it comes to the first two cases that we mentioned, maybe you need to have two parts of the pasuk. One is to tell you, for case number one that we mentioned, that you cannot marry your brother's wife, when he's still alive and he has children. And the other one is to tell you that even if he doesn't have children, if he's alive, you also cannot marry her. So the Gemara says, for that a pasuk is not needed. For the second case that we mentioned, that ein leibanim, that if one brother did not leave children and he's still alive, that one is not allowed to marry her. Mid Rav Huna nafka, we learned that from Rav Huna. That is something that we learned in the previous year. Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis, that the Torah uses the word when it comes to ishus, to the isur of eishesach kinida. That's the wording in the Torah. And the question is, how is she prohibited like a nida? Asked Rav Huna, is she always a nida? And the answer was that just like a nida is a woman, that even though eventually she will be permitted, because her flow will end and she'll go to the mikveh, v'chuli. Nevertheless, until all of the conditions are met, she's asur. Likewise, one brother's wife that does not have children, even though eventually, if he were to die, being that there's no children, there would be a mitzvah of yibum, but that's only later. But now she's still asur. Now, meaning when he's alive. So we already know that when he's alive, regardless, with or without children, he can't marry her. So again, so the seif of the pasuk remains extra to teach us that Eishes Ach is also from a maternal brother, min ha'em. So still the Gemara is unhappy. And Chada, the Yesh Labana Machai Baila, one is to tell you that you cannot marry her when your brother is alive. The other pasuk is to teach you that when the brother died, if he has a child or children, then you cannot marry her. So the Gemara says, one second, Yesh labanim la'achar misas baila. For that you don't need to have a pasuk. Because since when it comes to the mitzvah of Yibum, the Mida Amar Achmana, the Torah says that the mitzvah is only when there are no children. So implicitly we learn that Hayesh Labanim Asurim. Counters the Gemara, that's not correct. Dilma, if not for the seif of this pasuk, if not for the words, one might have said that Ein Labanim, if you have the classical case of a woman who became a widow without children, there's a mitzvah of yibum, and she is asura la'alma, she's not allowed to marry anyone else. But v'shariya liyavam, she's allowed and mechuyev to marry the yavam. Yesh labanim, if she leaves children, maybe there's taka no mitzvah of yibum the way the mitzvah normally is, but she's shariya la'alma, she's allowed to marry anyone, but she's also allowed to marry her brother-in-law. In other words, if not for the seif of the pasuk, you still could have argued that one would be allowed to marry Eishes Ach when the brother died, even if they left children. Inami, or I would say that Ein Labanim, we would understand the pasuk of Yibum that there is an obligation to marry her when there's no children. But when she has children, there's no mitzvah, but it's still permissible with a shus. Another option, Inami, one might have said that Ein Labanim, when the brother dies childless, that's when you have the mitzvah of Yibum. Yesh Labanim, but if she has children, Takaloi, then you're not allowed to marry her. But this should only be a lav that is understood from a mitzvah saseh. It's called the lav haba michlal aseh. And whenever Hashem gives us to understand that something is prohibited, and it gives us to understand that not by explicitly saying that so-and-so is asur, but by implying it when he's giving us a mitzvah saseh, it only has the severity, the power of a mitzvah saseh, and it doesn't carry with it the penalty of kares. So we're back to the question. So the seif of the pasuk erva he perhaps is needed to tell you that in all cases, aside of the case where one dies childless, means he's not living and without children, in all other cases the isur remains, but maybe only min ha'av. So the Gemara answers that kosav kra achrina ervas achiv gila. The pasuk ervas achiv gila, when it comes to the isur of Eishes Ach, is teaching you that whenever there is children, the isur erva with kares remains. So yes, so ervas achicha, he is extra, and ervas achicha extra teaches you bein min ha'av and bein min ha'em. And now, bringing it all back, from there we learn to achais ishtay bein min ha'av and bein min ha'em. Now, as the Gemara, why don't we say that when it comes to the mitzvah of Yibum, Eishes Ach min ha'em, that if a person has a brother, a maternal brother, who dies without children, maybe there should be the mitzvah of Yibum there as well. And as we learned a lot in the beginning of this Masechta, that the mitzvah of Yibum only goes to a paternal brother, not to a maternal brother. Why don't we say minu ayim just like eishes ach minu av? That ma eishes ach minu av la'achar misa's bailam sharia. There's a mitzvah of yibum. Af eishes ach minu ayim la'achar misa's bailam sharia. So the Gemara answers Amar Kra, that in this same pasuk that we quoted before, that has the extra ending of ervas achicha he. The word he is extra. It's written hey vav aleph, but it's pronounced he, and he comes to teach you b'haviyase tehe, which means that she remains in her present state of isur. She's always asur. It says even if she becomes a widow without children, what's that? She's always asur. There's the mitzvah of yibum. No, there is one sister-in-law that remains always asur, and that is one sister-in-law that is only related through the maternal. This is one maternal's brother's wife. Now the Gemara continues. We learned yesterday the hekesh of Rabbi Yoina. At the end of the parsha of the Arayos, the Torah says generally that if anyone has any relation with any one of the above mentioned Arayos, then v'nichrasu, then there's a punishment of kares. So now, since the Torah mentioned the Isur of Kares when it comes to all of the Arayos, and we applied it to all of them, so now the question that we're going to be speaking about is that why did the Torah have to specify by Achoisai that there is an Isur of Kares? Achoisai, the Kasev Bakares. Lamali, why that would have been known anyway from the general Isur Kares on all of the Arayos? Answers the Gemara Lechad Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan says that what would happen if a person had a relation with many different women, all b'shoigeg, without knowing that it's prohibited? And as we learned before, especially Masechta Shabbos, that there's a concept of helam achas, and there's a concept of yediyah bentayim. Helam achas means that when a person does something inadvertently, without the knowledge that it's prohibited, when that's a lav, which carries the penalty of kares, and therefore when it's done b'shogeg you bring a chatos, the question were to be, what happens if a person did various such violations, but without knowing in between one violation and another that it's asur? The question will be, since it's done all in one state of forgetfulness, perhaps you only have to bring one carbon chatos. So the reason why the Torah specified Achoisa Isur Kares is to tell you that even if there was no knowledge in between these prohibited relationships, a person had relations with many of the Arayos, with different women, under one state of forgetfulness, that is Chayav al Kolachas Va'achas. How do we know that from? Because Hashem by Achoisa wrote specifically that you're Chayav Kares, and as Rashi points out, this is one of the Yud Gimel Midas, known as Davar Shahaya Bechlal. That if Hashem specified something that anyways would have been no, it doesn't only teach you the din for that case in where Hashem specified kares. Not only if one has a relationship with Achoisai and with any one other of the Arayos, Ayachai for each one of Chatos, but even if you had relations with other two of Arayos, or three of Arayos, God forbid, in one state of forgetfulness, you have to bring a carbon Chatos for every single violation. Asks the Gemara, but according to Rabbi Yitzchak, that learns something else from the Kares of Achoisai. The Amar Kol Chayav Krisus B'chlal Hayu. And therefore the question is, V'lama Yatzas HaKares B'Achoisai, and that's to teach you, L'doinoi B'Kares V'lei B'Malkus. There's a question that we will learn in Mir Tzashem Masechta Makis, and that will be the following. Before a person gets any penalty in a Beis Din, there has to be warning by the Eidim. Has to be Asra. And not only does one have to be warned that such and such is not allowed to be done, but the people or the person who gives the warning has to quote the pasuk and has to notify the person the penalty. Question is, if one was about to have a relation with the Isur Erva, and the person who gave the warning said that if you will do it, you will get malchus. Really, if a person would do it, the person gets kares. But if the one who gave Hasra said you will get malchus, so there are other opinions that hold that then the person will at least get malchus because there was a warning. There's proof that there was a warning. The person knew he's going to get flogged. Generally for Isurei Lav there is malchus, so you get malchus. Rabbi Yitzchak holds that you will not get malchus. And it's the reason why Hashem wrote again by Achoisei Kares to tell you that this is a violation that carries the penalty of Kares and not malchus. And therefore, if the pasuk and the same logic, and since this was said by Achoisai, so davar shahoye bechlal v'yatzam en laklal is l'lamed al klal kol yatz. So now the question is, l'chalik min olin, how will he know that yibehel lamachas yachayv al kol achas ve'achas? So nafkalei, Rabbi Yitzchak will learn it from an extra word isha. When it says mive'el isha benidas tumasa etc. And the word isha is extra, and that's to teach you l'chayv al kol isha ve'isha. Now the Gemara moves on. Again, kares is a penalty for all of the arayas. So the dasay the kasav barachmana aririm yihiyu or aririm yomusu. When it comes to the isser of one's father's brother's wife, the Torah says that if God forbid one has that relation, then aririm yomusu, they'll die cursed. The word aririm is a word that's used whenever there's the penalty of kares. And one of the consequences of kares, aside of one dying before one is 50, aside of the spiritual disconnect that one is punished with, aririm also means that one will die childless. But that's a punishment for all Isurei kares. So the same question, since kares is a punishment that was written in the general, any arroyas violation, the Torah says v'nichrasu. Why did Hashem have to specify by the dasai the word aririm? Says the Gemara Lichid Rabbah. Like Rabbah pointed out a contradiction. That in one place it says aririm yihu, that she will become, or they will become childless. It says in another pasuk aririm yamusu, that they will continue to be childless. Haketza, that each expression is referring to a different case, and one case complements the other. That yesh labanim, that if a person before they violated the Isur Kares, they already had children, and parenthetically we're speaking here about minor children, because adult children over Baram Bas Mitzvah, that banim lo yamusu, the children don't die because of the sins of the fathers. But when a person has young children, sometimes this is the consequence of Kares, then koivran, then the parents bury them. But ein lo banim. And another, likewise, if a person did not have children until they violated the Isur Kares, then they will not have children. Then hoylach al ariri, they continue aririm yamusu, they will die childless. And ve'itzrach lemichtav aririm yiu, ve'itzrach lemichtav aririm yamusu. And both of these scenarios need to be written in the Torah, because one will not automatically be derived from the other. Had the Torah notified that, God forbid, for violating an Isur Kares, one becomes childless, Havamina, one would have thought taka, that ad chete, that since the children were born before the sin, so when the person sinned, there were children who now, being that they're minors and they are extension of the parents, get punished. The parents get punished by losing the children. But maybe if the person had children after they sinned, they were not alive when the sin happened, and the very fact that they were born somehow shows that even though these people sinned, but nevertheless they're being given children. So if they were given children, why would they be taken away from them? You would have thought that they will not be taken away. So that's why the Torah uses one time the expression aririm yamusu, that even if they are born after the sin, they will still pass away. And reverse, I would have thought that which children pass away? The ones that were born after the parents sinned. But children that were born before the sin, maybe since they were born before any of the parents sinned, they will not die because of something that happened after they were born. So therefore, tzricha, we need to have both expressions. And that's the end of the sugya. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah mentioned that a act of cohabitation, an act of a relation, begins with ha'ara, with the beginning of a relation, and that affects mitzvah sibum. And that also, whenever there is a prohibition in arayos, the prohibition is violated, even if there was only the ha'ara, the beginning of an act of cohabitation. So ha'ara, chayavei lavin minalan. Where do we know? So before we learned, where do we know about Isur Kares? But where do we know that when a person is violating an Isur Lav, for example, one cannot have a relation with a mamzer or with a mamzeres, that the violation happened when ha'ara happened? So the Gemara says like this: Mi digal rachmana. Since the Torah told us, when it comes to the Isser of having a relation with a Shifcha Charufa, Rashi explains that a Shifcha Charufa is referring to a non-Jewish female slave who got married to an Eved Ivri. In the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, we learn about a rare scenario where a Jew can become a slave. And as the Torah there says, that while that Jew is an Eved Ivri, his master can give him, in so to say marriage, the master's shivcha kananis. Now that marriage is not a full-fledged marriage, which means that halachically they cannot affect a real union. So she's not, being that she's not a real married woman, if someone has a relationship with her, God forbid, it's not the normal one having a relationship with a married woman. So there's no Isur Kares, and by Eishes Ish there's a punishment, a capital punishment of Chenek, but there is an Isur Lav, and when the Torah speaks about the Isur Lav, for which the man has to bring an Asham, an Asham, Shifcha Charufa, the Torah says that if a man had a relation, Shichva Zera, if he had a relation in which there was a seminal omission, which implies that the violation only happens when there's a full act of cohabitation, when there is a Shichva Zera. And there, the one, if one only had ha'ara, he won't have to bring an asham, shifcha charufa. So, since that this is sort of relationship, she's not a real married woman, is only kaviyachal. And isur la'av, as it says in the Torah, lo yiyeh kadesh, a man should not be promiscuous. The fact that the Torah needed to say shivcha zera proves that in all the other chayavei lavin, even by ha'ara itself, there the person will be violating the isur lav. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, what kind of proof is that? Fakert. Mi degole rachmona ha'ara b'chayavei krisus. Since, as we learned in the previous year, that when the violation is a more severe violation, there, ha'ara is where the violation happened. So, l'cha'ira machlal, from there you should learn that when it comes to a lesser violation, chayavei lavin, the violation only happens by gmar bia. So Rav Ashi says no. If that would have been the case, in other words, if by all chayavei lavin, the violation only happens when there is a gmar bia, so lishtoi kram shifcha charufa, the Torah need not say by the isur of shifcha charufa, shichva zera. The fact that the Torah needs to say that by Shifcha Charufa there's only a violation by Shichva Zera, by a Gemar Bia. There, from there you learn that by all Chayavei Lavin the Isur is only by Ha'ara. So all the Rishonim ask, why did Hashem have to tell you by Kares that the Isur begins with Ha'ara? We can have a Kal V'chomer that if where there's only an Isur La'av, the Isur begins with Ha'ara, for sure by Isur Kares. So you can answer reverse. That maybe wherever there is a more serious punishment, which is the Isur Kares, the punishment of Kares, you only get Kares if a person has a Gemar Bia. Which is why the Torah both by Isur Kares needed to tell you that Ha'ara, like we learned by Nida, and the other Isuri Kares is the violation, and likewise we imply it from Shivcha Zera by Shivcha Charuf. And now the Gemara continues, the Chayavei Lavin de Kohuna, when it comes to the Isur, which is unique to Kohanim. And that's unlike the other Chayavi Lavim, as Rashi says, that is Isurim to everyone. We have to have a pasuk specifically for them. Minalon. So the Gemara answers that we learn it out from Kicha. Kicha, it says by normally Isuri Kares Kicha, and as we learned before, Kicha there means Ha'ara. It says by Isur Kohuna, that a Kohen Gadol cannot take an Almana, the word Kicha. So we learned one from the other. Ha'ara by Kares, that only Ha'ara already is the violation of Isurei Lav by Kohuna. And now the Chayavei Asei Minolan, there are certain Isurim, there are certain relationships that were not written in the Torah in a negative way, they were written in a positive way. As Rashi brings down all the way in the second to last line, that Mitzri and Adoimi, where the Torah says, Ad Doir Shlishi, that on the third generation you could marry into people who convert from those nations. Which implies that before the third generation, that means the Mitzri or his son, the Adoimi and his son or daughter, cannot marry into the Jewish congregation. How do you know that they're also the relationship that's prohibited begins with Ha'ara, turning the page? So the Gemara answers, that's learned, Mi Bia, again it says when it comes to the Yavei Lohem, that Dor Shlishi Yavei Lohem, the word Bia, it says Lo Yavei Mamzer, the general Chayavei Lavim, Bia, Ha'ara by Mamzer, Ha'ara by Mitzri and Adoimi, and by any other Lav, Haba Mechlal Asei. And now the Gemara continues, Yevamos l'shuk min olon. Where do we know? It says in the Torah, Loisia Eishes Hameis Hachutza Leishzar, that a woman who becomes a Yevama should not marry to the shuk. Narvas Yevama Yavayaleh. How do you know that if someone else had a relation with her, that he violated this lav, or this mitzvah saseh, with only ha'ara? So the Gemara right away wonders, what kind of question is that? Ilam the Amar Lav, if the Isur of Yevama L'Shuk is a lav, which is the opinion of many, because it says loisia, eishes hameis hachutza leishzar. Then we already said that by any lav, ha'ara already is the violation of the lav. And if we will hold like those people who learn that from the words loisia, eishes hameis hachutza leishzar, from there we learn that kedushin is not chal, even though there's only a chayiv lav. But the isur of her marrying is only learned from the ending of the pasuk, from the asay yevamos yavayaleh. Okay, who cares? So even if it's learned from the asay, we just learned bia bia, right, from Amoni and Mitzri, from the bia from mamzer, that even by an asay ha'ara is the isur. So the Gemara clarifies the question. Ela yevama liyavam minolan. How do we know the din of our Mishnah? That when it comes to the mitzvah of yibum, the mitzvah happens even when ha'ara happened. You don't need to have a gemar bia. For here you answer, asya, bia, bia. It says, yevama, yavai aleh. And going back, when it comes to the isur lav of mamzer, lo yavai mamzer, ha'ara there, ha'ara here. And how do we know that when a person is affecting nisuyin? I take that back. Rashi says, how do we know that when a person is being mekadesh a wife kiddushin? And before Rav, who was mangid, amanda mekadesh bebia, one of the options of kiddushin is through bia. There also ha'ara affects kiddushin. Asya kicha kicha. Oh, kicha kicha. Kicha by marriage and kicha by arois. And now Rava says the following. Amar Rava. Lama li the kasav rachmana shich vazera b'shifcha charufa. Now that we have the rule that normally ha'ara, the beginning of the act of cohabitation, is halachically considered the act of bia, why did Hashem specify by shifcha charufa that there it's shichva zera? It's an act of cohabitation that has in it some type of seminal emission, which implies a full act of cohabitation. Why did the Torah write it there? And obviously we just had the answer before, and the Gemara is going to say it right away. That's to teach you that love of a man having a relation with a shifcha charufa, for which he has to bring a asham shifcha charufa, there you need to have a gemar bia. But that's one exception. And the next question is shifcha zera be'eshes ish. When it comes to the isur of a man having a relation with an eshes ish, it says in the pasuk Rashi brings down vel eshes amischa leisitein shechaftecha lezora. The Torah specifies the word zera. Now really the isur is an isur which begins with ha'ara. Why do we have the word zera there? And likewise, the third case is by shichva zera b'soita. That what's the case? A man suspected his wife is having something inappropriate with another man. So he forewarned her in front of two witnesses. He was mekana her not to be with that man. And then there were two witnesses that saw them actually together, secluded, not knowing what they did together. So the Torah says that if the man lived with her, shichva zera, then she becomes asur. And is that indeed the case? L'cha'ira, if another man had a relation with her, even if it was only ha'ara, she also should become asur l'ba'al and l'boyel. So the Gemara goes through the cases. Shichva charufa, the reason why the Torah says shichva zera is like we explained before, that ha'ara will not make the man have to bring a asham. Ashes is there. The reason why the Torah uses the word shechaftecha lezera is prat lemeshamesh meis. It's to teach you a whole nother din. That if a man had a relation with a married woman, God forbid, and his organ was limp, was dead, and somehow he inserted it in her, he will not be punished for the isur of having a relation. That's not called a relation. So the Gemara says, one second, hanich lamanda amar, that is true, as we'll learn Mesechta Sanhedrin, in Mesechta Shavuos, that Mishamish Meis Ba'arayas Pater, that if a person had a relation with a limp organ, in all of the Arayas he's taka exempt. El Lamando Amar Chayiv, but there are other opinions that disagree with that. So Ma'ikal Meimer, again, what does Shechaftecha Lezara refer to? What does it exclude? By Isur Erva, by Eshes Ish. Elo, answers the Gemara, prat, it comes to exclude lemeshamish mesa. If a man has a relation with a not living erva, not living eshesish, she died. Now, l'chayra, if she died, of course there's no isur, or there's no isur kares. So the Gemara says it's not true. The salkadai tachamina, one might have thought, hoya la'achar misa nami ikre she'eroi. You see, a kohen cannot become impure to any corpse, with the exception of the 7 closest relatives. One of the 7 is she'eroi, which means his wife. That if a kohen's wife dies by her burial, he could be metama, or he should be metama to her. Now l'chayra, you can argue, once she died, she's no longer his wife. Elama, by the fact that she is still called she'eroi. So Ema l'chayiv Allah be'eshes ish. So maybe a woman who is married, who now died, is still called a married woman, and if a man has a relation with her corpse, he should be chayiv the violation of Kadis. Kumash Milan, that the reason why the Torah says shechafta chol zera only comes to tell you that she has to be alive. The Soita, why does the Torah use the word Shichva Zera by Soita? Look at the Tanya. Shichva Zera, says the Braisa, that comes to exclude Davar Acher. Comes to exclude Davar Acher, something else. So now the Gemara wants to clarify my Davar Acher. Amar Rab Sheshes says that Prat, this comes to exclude a case, that if a man who, when he was warning his wife not to be with a certain man, didn't give a stam warning, don't be with him, don't seclude with him, don't have a physical relation with him, but he specified, I do not want you to have a shaloi kedarka, act of cohabitation with that man. If that was the only thing he was mekana for, then even if she has yichud with him, she will not become asur. Learn from the word shech vazer. Amarava, that's not true. Since mishkevei ishaksiv, that since when the Torah, when it speaks about not having a relation with a woman with whom one cannot have a relation with, the Torah one time uses the expression mishkevei isha, a plural expression of acts of cohabitations, and it is from there that we learned that bia shaloi kedarka is just like bia kedarka. So why indeed will she not be a saita? Even if he only warned his wife, don't do bia shaloi kedarka with that man. That's also a proper kinoi. Elo amarava prat l'shekino l'darechivorim. That the word shechva zera comes to exclude the case of a saita in which a man only explicitly told his wife, I don't want you to have bodily contact with him. In other words, he's saying, I'm not worried about you having an act of cohabitation. I'm not warning you for that. I don't want you to have a stam to have any type of bodily contact with him. Amalei Abaya, to which Abaya counters that Pritzusa Asar Achmana, that if that was his warning, and of course that's something that's prohibited, but will that actually make her into a saita? L'cha'ira, a bodily contact, but that does not have an act of penetration, that's something that's pritzazdik, it's unsniyazdik, but that should not make her us. Elam Rabaya, so Abaya explains that prat l'shekinah b'neshika, that this is when a person told his wife that I don't want you to have any type of genital contact with him. No, it's neshika refers to the private parts. That the warning was again only don't do neshika with him, and Sheikh Vazera tells you that if that was the warning, she will not become a saita. Ask the Gemara in 1 second. Ha'ara, as we said before, is called an act of cohabitation. And what does ha'ara mean? Now we're going to explain what it means. This will make sense according to the opinion that holds that ha'ara means hachnasas haTorah. It means when one inserted the corona, and not neshika. So since being that neshika is not yet called an act of cohabitation, so the Torah by Soita excludes a man who warned his wife explicitly, don't do neshika, she will not become a Soita. But according to the opinion that holds that ha'ara is neshika, so if he warned his wife not to do an act of neshika, well, that's a full-fledged Soita warning. So therefore the Gemara says, according to that man the Omer, we're going to have to give the previous answer, which was the answer of and still the Torah needs to exclude her from becoming a Saita. Because the Baal that the whole idea of a Saita is that the man is upset with his wife, and we give credibility to his being upset, to his kapeda that his wife is somehow being inappropriate with another man. And if that is the case, being that it bothers him, and he's telling her, I don't want you to have any type of derech evarim relationship with that man, he's upset about that, he's makbid on that. And therefore one would think that if she had yichud with him, if there was a stira with him, even if it was only derech evarim, she should become a soita. Kumash Malon, the Torah needs to tell you Shechva Zera. And now that we brought up the sugya of what is ha'ara, now let's speak about both sides. So Amar Shmuel says that ha'ara zu nishika. Ha'ara means simply any genital contact, even without penetration. That is the act of cohabitation, and where do we know that from? So Shmuel says like this, Mashallah Adam. Let me give you an example of a person, Shemaniach etzboi al piv. A person who puts his finger on one's mouth, a person touches one's lips, that it's impossible that when you touch your lips, that one's finger doesn't push inside the lips. In other words, really every act of neshika has some type of hachnasa, and that's ha'ara. However, ki asir Rabba bar bar Chana, when he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan like this, that Gmar Bia B'Shivcha Charufa, that when the Torah, as we mentioned before, gave the exception, one of them is the exception of you're only Chayev Hasham Shivcha Charufa if there was a Shechva Zera, there it means Hachnasa Zatara. Hachnasa Zatara means that the corona was inserted. That is the meaning of a Gmar Bia. So that fakir, so that Rabbi Yochanan substantiates Shmuel's statement. If that is the case, if a Gmar Bia is Achnasa Zatara, then the beginning of a Bia should mean, like Shmuel said, Nishika. Masav Rab Sheshis, it says in the Braisa, Shechva Zera, that the fact that the Torah by Shivcha Charufa says Shechva Zera teaches you Eina Chayiv Ela Al Bias Hamiruk, that a person is only Chayiv when there is ejaculation. So l'chayda, my love miru gid. Does that not mean that there was a full insertion? So the Gemara says lav dafka, loy miru katara. That what Rabbi Yochanan said is correct. That achnasas atara is considered the act of gemar bia by a shivcha charufa, and that's still called shechva zera because there was a miruk. Okay, so now we have that version of what Shmuel said, of what Rabbi Yochanan said, which was brought to us by Rabba Barbar Chana. However, Kiyasa Avdimi Rabbi Yochanan, but when Avdimi came from Israel, he quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that ha'ara is achnasa zatara. That ha'ara is called achnasa zatara. So Amru lei, so they told Ravdimi, but Rabba Bar Chana lo yamarachi. He just quoted Rabbi Yochanan that Gemar Bia is achnasa zatara, not ha'ara. So Amar Lahu, so Ravdimi acknowledged that his version of Rabbi Yochanan is not like Rabba Bar Chana's. Ihu shakrai or yano shakrai. Either I'm wrong or he's wrong. There's no reconciliation. And I'm right and he's wrong. And to back him up, we quote another version that Kiyasa Ravin in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He said, Ha'ara is achnasa satar. So now the Gemara says like this, that when Ravin said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, that Ha'ara is achnasa satar, so Adarabba Bar Chana Vadi Palik, that for sure disagrees with Rabba Bar Chana's version that said that Achnasa Zatara is called Gmar Bia. However, the question is, does he argue with Shmuel or not? Shmuel was the one that said Ha'ara is Nashika. Perhaps you can argue that Shmuel's statement that Ha'ara is Nashika and Rabbi Yochanan's statement that Ha'ara is Achnasa Zatara is not a contradiction. In other words, Ha'ara is from the act of Nashika until the Achnasa Zatara. All of that time, it's still only called ha'ara, and Gemar Bia is Gemar Bia. Perhaps. In other words, Milema Palik. Lav Dafka, he argues, because you can argue that from the moment of Nashika until the Achnasa Zatara, including Achnasa Zatara, all that is ha'ara karila. And as Shmuel himself explained, really an act of cohabitation means penetration. Shmuel says it begins with Nashika because when there is Nashika, there was some type of penetration. So that is what we're saying right now. However, we're going to clarify that actually he argues with Shmuel, that because Kiyasa Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan says that Ha'ara means Hachnasa Zatara. And Rabbi Yochanan said, Gemar Bia means Gemar Bia Mamish. And Rabbi Yochanan said that Mikan Ve'elach means less then Hachnasa Zatara is only called Nashika, Upater Oleha. And therefore, according to that version of Rabbi Yochanan, for sure, Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel disagree. Pater Oleha, in all of the Arroyas, which only miha'ara ve'elach is when one is violating that erva, or chiyuv lav, or chiyuv asay. Less than that, it's an act of pritzus. And as we mentioned before, it's not only an act of prishus, he's spotted from the penalty of the act of cohabitation. But when it says loisikrivu legalis erva, so taka, there's no isur kares. We clarified that a couple of weeks ago for the kirva, for the being close. But b'chlal, there's the isur of being too close to any woman with whom one cannot have a relation with, and that includes, according to most of the poskim, the isur daraisa, for example, and isur yichud loisikrivu legalis. Or when it comes to any act of any contact of chiba, for sure, according to everyone, is asan mid'oraisa, including the shika. It's an act of chiba. But the isur of bia, which begins normally with ha'ara, only begins, according to this version of Rabbi Yechanan, by achnasas haTorah, not by neshika. We'll stop over here.